Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Philip Hyman. I'm a professor at Harvard Law School and at the Kennedy School of Government. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this forum, a program with General Barry McCaffrey, sponsored by the Institute of Politics and the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. I've had the pleasure of introducing General McCaffrey before. A lot of it sort of falls so easily if you ever have to introduce anybody. He's the guy you'd like to introduce. The most highly decorated and the youngest four-star general in the Army. A hero, quite legitimately a hero. 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2 Silver Stars for heroism, 3 Purple Hearts. I generally take the occasion of saying if he was smarter, he wouldn't have been shot 3 times.
By the same guy.
Yeah. All 3 Purple Hearts took place from activities in Washington while drugs are. Commander of one of the major sweeps operations that formed Operation Desert Storm. An assistant to Colin Powell as a senior officer in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. A Kennedy School alumnus of the National Security Program. He's got a quite remarkable biography. It seems to me that the best thing I can say by way of a few introductory remarks is to say something about what I think it takes to be drug czar, because it takes a very unusual group of attributes. It takes wisdom, it takes political courage, and it takes an immense amount of political savvy. Wisdom. The problem of drugs is hard. They're great human and dollar costs. The federal dollar costs are 15 billion, the state dollar costs are 15 billion, something like that. The human costs are immense. We arrest 1 million plus people for drug offenses every year in the United States. We put 100,000 in the penitentiary. We've turned our penitentiaries black with drug offenders. We decimate community structures. And if we didn't do that, we would have a rampant drug. The benefits of that are drug prices for cocaine, which are 15 times what they would be in a hospital. For heroin, Mark could tell us 60 times, something like that. And the drugs would wreak terrible havoc. But these are tough choices, and it's hard to do well. The one sign of wisdom that you can see for sure is if someone's smart enough to see that there isn't an easy solution and that there isn't a quick solution. Barry McCaffrey is a general or a retired general who's been consistently opposed to calling this a war on drugs. He insists on using a medical metaphor. He says it's like cancer, it's going to be with us for a long time, and we're going to have to deal with it like a long-term chronic disease. He's obviously aware of the harms and takes the harms of that drugs do and that enforcement does, both seriously, as well as the numbers of total people affected. In a final sign of wisdom is the recognition, which he has had from the beginning, that important as law enforcement may be, it won't solve the problem, not just in the sense that it won't ever be solved, but that prevention and treatment are crucial components, very crucial components. His emphasis has been on prevention. Second, the job takes moral and political courage. You have to be prepared to think about the unthinkable, and when you can, talk about the unthinkable. The effect of our sentencing structure on minority communities is something I've just mentioned. In the latest drug strategy statement, which the leader of ONDCP has to issue every year, he talks about for laws to be effective, they must be seen as equitable by everyone. The harshness of our drug sentences are something that have to be addressed. The 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine. In the latest statement, he talks about punishment having to be put on a par with the offense. And that means not out of line with the offense. You have to recognize the limits of interdiction. That's a part of wisdom, because our borders are too long, the ways of smuggling drugs in too many for that to be a solution rather than just part of the solution. But it's a hard thing to say, and it takes moral courage to say it. And Barry McCaffrey is a general who's been prepared to say it. It also takes moral courage to recognize that the havoc worked by tobacco and alcohol is more than comparable to the other harms, to the other and illicit drugs. And he has never been shy about that subject either. Finally, to be drug czar takes a very high level of political skill. It's a job with 150 people working for him, a relatively small budget in the millions, trying to supervise a federal program of $15 billion that is operated by a number of powerful departments with long traditions of independence. That requires an immense amount of skill as a bureaucratic operator, and General McCaffrey has it. You also have to have political savvy in terms of electoral politics and in terms of public opinion. You have to come to be accepted by both parties, although in this last election year, General McCaffrey was an immense advantage to the president as the Republicans tried to attack the drug policy of the Clinton administration. You have to maintain your neutrality. He's been able to do that. You have to build support throughout the country, locally, for our drug policies and for the strategies that he puts out. And you have to have the wisdom to see things like the centrality of children, which he's made central to our drug policy. On the other hand, it would help if you avoided a fight over the medical use of marijuana. And with that little bit of advice, General McCaffrey, I turn it to you.
Well, Phil, I thank you for the introduction. You put me in the unenviable position of the introduction may be more stimulating than the major address. I did like your remarks. I think you put it in a very succinct manner. It's great fun. It's an honor to be back at this famous university. I mean that. I've been coming here for years. I used to come here and talk about nuclear deterrence and how to form cooperative relationships with the Russians. I love that program, bringing in the Russian generals and trying to involve us in tearing apart 50 years of mistrust. I came back when I was a commander-in-chief in Southern Command to try and talk about Latin America and why it is central to our future, and to try and, in some ways, confront the abysmal ignorance of Americans about their economic and political and cultural future, which lies on the north-south axis. And I'm delighted to come back nowadays in this responsibility and try and lay out some of our thinking, and more importantly, learn while I'm here from a collection of some of the brightest people in America. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and Phil Sharp, the IOP director, and Mark Moore and Howard Schaefer. I'll be back up to talk at the Zinsberg Award, and Terry Scott, my old friend, probably the best combat soldier in the Army, and a very bright person who loves young people, and I was delighted to see you include him in this distinguished faculty. And a couple of old friends, Bill Murdy and Jack Jacobs, both very successful businessmen. I thank them for being here. I've known them for years. Jack is also, besides being a pretty astute international fellow in the business world, one of our country's Medal of Honor winners. And it's a great honor for him to be here tonight to listen and to take part in this discussion. A couple of pieces of paper that I'll just draw your attention to, and perhaps they'll be helpful to your own thinking. Hopefully there's a handout, and you can take it away, and it may have some numbers there that you find useful to your own deliberations. And it certainly outlines in some way our concern about young people, and hopefully that'll be sort of the central part of some very brief remarks. I'll also tell you something that isn't on the table yet, but on 25 February, we hope we'll have the President put the National Drug Strategy 1997 in front of the American people with a bipartisan participation in the White House or wherever we elect to do it. We're debating, a White House or a school. It's, we think, a useful conceptual framework to think about the drug issue in America and to think about it and to try and organize ourselves in a more effective way. $33 billion of direct expenditures on this issue. $49 billion of illegal drug money spent by Americans, fueling, in some ways, as I tell people, we don't have all the drug addicts in the world, we get too much money. And our drug money fuels international crime, and the consequences on some of our democratic partners, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Thailand, are devastating. And we're going to try and organize ourselves, and as Phil quite correctly said, a lot of us think this metaphor war on drugs was unhelpful. It's colorful language. It's good language to mobilize public opinion. But as I tell people, look, I know about war. I've been studying war or involved in it since I was 17 years old. And this challenge doesn't lend itself to conceptualizing it in terms of warfare. Who's the enemy? Where's the campaign that achieves total victory? What are the surprise attacks? Is somebody in charge? Do we have unity of command? Am I the drug czar and I'm going to direct a national solution to this? We don't have czars in this country. Come on. We organized a government around a central principle that nobody's in charge, and we like it that way. About the only people who even pretend they're responding to directions are the armed forces. The rest of it, it's an endless policy debate with the decibel level of the debate rising and falling. We have enormous concentration on our rights to privacy, to due process. We're not going to be Singapore. We're not going to be the Marine Corps in dealing with drug abuse. What are we going to do? Well, first of all, it seems to me you've got to have a coherent approach. You can't pick one thing you're going to do. You can't say, I'm either going to address the problems of drug production in Peru, Bolivia, and Burma, or I'm going to do drug treatment to try and get at the problem of drug addiction in Boston, New York, San Francisco, and rural Iowa. We can't either do drug prevention programs aimed at young people starting in the 6th grade or do a Coast Guard DEA customs attempt to reduce drug smuggling through the Caribbean and our ports of entry with Mexico. You have to do all of it in some balanced, sensible way. Now, any smart bureaucrat, any consummate, wily coyote in the Washington arena would tell you, don't ever tell people your priorities. If you do, if you have 10 priorities clearly articulated, the guy whose priority 4 and 8 will be outraged that they're not 3 and 7. We have one priority, it seems to us, in this national drug strategy. The priority is young people. Now let me briefly describe why. Why are we concerned about drug abuse in America? Most of us don't use drugs. There's a bunch of Americans, 265 million people, this huge, vibrant, energetic nation. We pay our taxes at higher rates than any other civilized nation on the face of the earth. We have more associations than any other society on the face of the earth. We go to church more than any other society on the face of the earth, except the Irish. They don't know why they're going to church. We have tremendous sense of family, of community. We have an honest police force. 265 million of us, 12 million regularly using illegal drugs. 3.6 million of that number, reasonably small percentage, 5% of the population using illegal drugs, 3.6 million are addicted to cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, Rohypnol, PCP. Another 10 to 18 million addicted to alcohol, a legal, mildly addictive drug. Does tremendous damage to our society. The illegal drugs kill 16,000 people a year, cost us $70 billion. It is a tragedy. What do you do about it? Well, there's a bunch of things we got to do about it, and we can talk in the Q&As about drug treatment. The least credibility we have in this whole program is drug treatment. If you don't like crime and violence and property damage and ineffectiveness in the workforce and dropping out of universities and spouse abuse, then you'll like effective drug treatment programs aimed at people in the criminal justice system in particular. But the one priority is children. We say we got 68 million American adolescents, 18 and below. Drug abuse in America now starts in the 6th grade, serious drug exposure in our society. By the 8th grade, there is significant levels of drug abuse. It's tripled in the last 5 years. By senior year in high school, 1 out of 5, we say, high school seniors are regularly using drugs. Now I can turn it around and I can say, look, 80% of American youngsters 12 to 17 have never touched an illegal drug. True. But the problem is it gets worse, middle school on up through early adolescent years, and we believe the data seems to show, Columbia University studies on gateway behavior tend to demonstrate that if you use illegal drugs in your early adolescent years, if you use them more rather than less, if you smoke cigarettes, binge drink, you will set yourself up for an addictive problem later on in life. That's it. The more you do it, the younger you are, the more likely you are to have an addictive problem in life. It isn't a moral thing, it's a neurochemical thing. We're starting to get that point now. You can take metabolic PET scans of the brain using glucose function and see the impact of drug addiction on your brain. It changes the dopamine pathways. This isn't just a failure of the spirit, this is a neurochemical problem. We want kids to make it to age 21 without demonstrating those behaviors. If they do, by the way, you don't start smoking cigarettes your last year in law school. You don't start an alcohol problem after your second baby. You don't pick up cocaine use as you start your first business. Basically, these are adolescent problems. There are a lot of reasons why that happens or doesn't happen. It's a very complicated issue. Columbia University did a great study. It said, who's not using drugs and why? A lot of kids aren't using drugs. If you're eating supper with your parents 5 nights a week, you're not using drugs. If you're going to church or synagogue on the weekends, you're not doing drugs. If when you get out of the safest place in America, which is a school, the least violence, the least drugs, the least sex, the biggest concentration of adults who are educated and who love and care for you, if you get out of that school and you've got 3 to 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. until your mother with 2 jobs gets home, a single parent, or your dual income parents get home, or your dysfunctional family arrives back in the home, you're on your own except for other adolescents and TV. It's a problem. Look, my 2 daughters are professional women. They're involved in helping create American society. So if we're going to do that, and thank God we're doing it, we have to organize our society not for more effective anti-drug lectures, but instead for more effective engagement of American young people in options. We're going to have to rethink it. If we don't, we're going to see drug abuse among adolescents go back where it was 15 years ago. It was double the problem 15 years ago than it is now. And we suggest to people that down the line we're going to regret not having gotten organized. Now, who's going to solve the problem? Me? Not on your life. I'm going to assemble a drug strategy. I'm going to try and back sensible policies and procedures that take $16 billion of drug money, which is what the president just sent down to the Hill, 800 million more than last year, and I might add, Phil, a 22% increase in goal number 1, meaning reduce drug abuse among young people, public health issues. We're going to try and invest up front in that problem so that we don't end up 20 years from now saying, in 1997, we had 1.6 million people in prison. more than any other society on the face of the earth. We now believe, the people that study the issue, it's going to grow 25% by the end of the century. We're willing to pay $22K a head to lock somebody up. We have problems assembling the political will to pay more than $3 a head for drug education and prevention programs for children in America. We have difficulty getting $2,000 a head for a children at risk sanctuary school where you run at 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 at night, you feed a hot lunch, a hot supper, and you have structured activities to engage young people. We say the argument's been poorly made because these programs do work. If you spend $2,000 a head on high school children at risk, you'll save $2 million on an addicted young adult later on in life. We got to get serious about the whole effort. Our future's at stake, and I might add, one of our biggest challenges on this is a lot of people think it's hopeless. It's so hopeless that it doesn't concern me, and I don't want to get involved in it because I know that drug abuse is Hispanic people or poor people or black people or urban people. It couldn't be my people, but it is. Now, some odd things. We remind people, drug abusers, 3 out of 4 are employed, and they're overwhelmingly white. And if you wanted to sort drug abuse in America by race, which isn't a terribly helpful thing to do, it would go white, black, Hispanic. And you'd recognize that anesthesiologists, health professionals, have one of the highest rates of addiction in America, with legal drugs misdirected. And you'd know that white teenagers use cocaine and smoke cigarettes more than black teenagers. And you'd start reminding yourself that the consequences of drug abuse are different depending on the population you're dealing with. But the impact on children is devastating regardless of the group you're looking at. The children are our focus. And if we can work on that for 10 years, not for 2 years, not with cute programs, not with knowledge development areas that spring up and die away, but with a sustained, coherent, balanced effort based on the best wisdom we can find around the country, we think we're going to make a difference. One comment on medical marijuana, because Phil generously left that steaming offering in my plate as I stood up here. It's a peripheral issue. Come on, it's $70 billion a year. We got half the treatment capability this country needs. We got a fraction of the treatment capability we need in the criminal justice system. We're willing to fund 5th and 6th grade DARE programs, and that's it for drug prevention and education. We make fun of midnight basketball, but we're willing to support a rigorous law enforcement operation. We simply have to sort this one out. Now, medical marijuana, to what degree does American medicine need smoked pot to deal with wasting syndrome, glaucoma, pain management? It's a medical scientific issue. Let the National Institute of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, the AMA, the CMA, the American Cancer Society, the American Ophthalmological Society, let health professionals judge it as safe and effective through peer group review of rigorous scientific proposals. And if it is needed for American medicine, hands down the best, the most effective on the face of the earth, we'll make it available. Methamphetamines and cocaine are Schedule II drugs that have utility for physicians. They're very dangerous substances, but they're useful. THC, synthetic cannabinoid, is available with a prescription in a pharmacy since 1985. Too big a dose makes old folks who haven't smoked any pot before a little goofy. They don't like it. Doctors don't like it in general because there's better substances. It clearly, probably, a bad thing to do for glaucoma. But let the FDA, Harold Varmus, a reasonably bright lad, the NIH director, Nobel Prize laureate, we think he's got a handle on scientific research. He's going to bring together the community, and they'll reopen the question of smoke pot and is it useful for doctors, yes or no. And I asked the American Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, go review the literature and tell us scientifically what do we know and not know. And they'll go do that as a separate effort. But I think that politicians ought to stay out of it. I think we ought to stop focusing on it. We need to organize ourselves and get the energy to deliver the goods on drug education and prevention and treatment and to focus on our kids. I would urge the debate to move back to center stage because we're sending this over to Congress along with $16 billion, and I need the intelligent support and involvement of compassionate, involved people to include at this university. Thanks very much.
We're going to have two respondents, each talking for just a few minutes before we open the floor to questions. The first respondent is my longtime friend, Mark Moore, the Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice Policy and Management, stationed here at the Kennedy School. Mark is the father of serious study of drug policy, having begun in 1970, and he continues to lead with a clarity of vision that no one else quite matches. Mark? And he better be good now.
I'd like to thank Professor Hyman and thank General McCaffrey for being here this evening and giving me an opportunity to give a 2-hour lecture on drug policy to a larger audience than I could otherwise assemble. I know that the job of a Harvard professor in a situation like this is to find something terribly wrong with a presenter's presentation. I'm embarrassed to admit I don't find that. I find myself in very broad agreement with the approach that General McCaffrey and the Office of National Drug Control Policy is taking in their efforts to lead the American public toward a sensible policy that holds promise for reducing the problem in the future. I have to confess, though, that I'm not entirely sure that's an objective piece of evidence that I'm offering there. I have to confess to you tonight that I was for 2 years an employee of the Drug Enforcement Administration, and there was a moment when we were traveling around the southwest border, and I was in the company of the DEA agents and a group of, I think it was called the Southwestern Border Narcotics Enforcement Agency group, and we were having a barbecue at a shooting gallery literally a rifle range outside of El Paso, Texas, for that. I'd like to be clear about that. And we'd had probably a few too many drinks, and we were getting sentimental, as law enforcement types are apt to do in circumstances like that. And they swore me to the brotherhood of narcs. All right, so I am now an official member of the narcs, and you can call me Mark the Narc. Right. And I'm not sure that that hasn't forever influenced my views about what drug policy should be. But I'd like, for the purposes of my response, to draw some underlinings of some things General McCaffrey said, which seem to me to be very important, and then maybe add one additional contribution that I'd like to make as an observation about drug policy. The first is that he treats drugs as an important independent threat. It's not that the country doesn't have problems with poverty and racism and inequality and a variety of other economic ills. But in that context, in that social context, drugs have the opportunity to worsen our circumstance as an independent causal factor, right? So that it isn't true that drug use is endemic to the society and merely a symptom of larger problems. It is true that drug use in a society that has other troubles could turn out to worsen our troubles in very significant ways. And I think that's important for all of us to keep in mind. A second related point is that drug use in the United States turns out to not be entirely endemic. We have a big endemic problem called the alcohol and smoking problem, but we have an epidemic problem that comes upon us intermittently that is associated with heroin and cocaine. And in my experience in drug policy, I've been at this game for about 26 years. And in my experience, the country has lived through 2 rather significant drug epidemics. All right? It hasn't been facing a systematic endemic drug situation. It has faced 2 serious drug epidemics. The first was a heroin epidemic that hit the country in the late 60s and mid-70s, and that was pretty significant. It had an impact on crime rates that you could observe, it took a serious toll on people's health, and it took a serious toll on family life. But I'll tell you, that epidemic, which was the one that I first started working on, was nothing compared to the cocaine epidemic that hit the country starting in the early 80s and proceeded throughout the 80s. And the cocaine epidemic, I think, was about 4 times the size of the heroin epidemic. And unlike the heroin epidemic, which confined its ravages to men, the cocaine epidemic reached out and included women. And because women have turned out to be important in structuring and holding families together, it reached into America's families and had a devastating impact there as well. And in case you don't believe that, it's important to look at the statistics on child abuse and neglect to see some of the consequences of that. So I think we've had a hugely important epidemic of cocaine use now that seems to have topped out, as epidemics do. But we haven't fully reckoned the price that the country has paid for that cocaine epidemic that came upon us in the mid-'80s to the early '90s. So it's an epidemic problem, and therefore policy has to respond to it not just as an endemic problem caused by social conditions, but also as an epidemic that threatens to break around our ears periodically. I think if you have that picture, then the idea that General McCaffrey is offering to us, which is that prevention is a very important part of our response, is just right, all right? That what we have to do is work very hard at preventing ourselves from getting into the situation, and when an epidemic hits us, to prevent it from getting large, and then understand that once the epidemic tops out, or where people begin learning once again that these drugs are dangerous, that we'll have to pile in behind it a set of satisfactory responses to the casualties that we've taken in the first round of the epidemic. And I think in that context, our preference for using prisons as opposed to treatment responses to people who have been casualties of the drug epidemic is bad. But I want to say that in the early stages of an epidemic, and in dealing with the future threat, we need to combine preventive efforts, and those preventive efforts include not only education, which is the idea that most people have of prevention, but also the use of law and the mobilization of law as an instrument of social instruction about appropriate conduct. I want to treat law in this. This is the contribution that I'd like to make. I'd like you to imagine that prevention is partly a function of education. And what we do when we educate people is we talk to them as individuals, we try to engage their rationality, we try to help them understand that it would be bad to use drugs because of the future consequences. And that's a very attractive approach to prevention because it dignifies the people that we're talking to. It recognizes their individuality, doesn't use much state authority, doesn't even use much state money, and it offers the hope of strengthening their resolve to avoid using drugs. But I also want to put on the same page the idea that law and criminal law is an important educative device in the population as well, and an important additional preventive instrument for controlling or for preventing drug use in the future. The most obvious effect of law and criminal law is to reduce the availability of drugs. I don't mean make it impossible to get. I used to have a theorem that said if we could increase the amount of time it took for kids to find drugs from 5 minutes to 2 hours, we would have a significant impact on the levels of drug use in the country. And I still believe that's true. And if we're having that effect, I can testify to that fact. I tried once to figure out whether there was any deterrent effect of law enforcement, and I tried to do this by going out and buying drugs myself. And as I went and wandered around the streets trying to buy drugs, you heard the muttering, "Gee, the cops are getting shorter." Now, this was, to me, evidence that there was, in fact, a deterrent effect, and that was at least protecting short white guys from getting drugs. And it may have nonetheless not had as significant an effect for others, but it was reducing some of us weak-willed people's opportunities to use drugs. But more important, or as important as the reducing of availability, is essentially the effect that the law can have for mobilizing a social response to drugs. I keep thinking, I'm a parent of teenage children, and I don't think I ever fully resorted to the excuse that you shouldn't use drugs because they're illegal, right? but I took comfort in the fact that they were illegal. And I always had that sort of someplace in the back of my mind when I was talking to my kids about a variety of reasons why it would be bad to use drugs. And I was comforted by the idea that when they left my house, they wouldn't find it convenient to get access to drugs. And I was very grateful to the criminal law and to the enforcement agencies that were making it possible for me to operate in that situation. The last way to think about the law in this, in some ways, goes something like this. When we're appealing to, or way to think about it is, again, going back to this epidemic metaphor, one of the reasons that epidemics eventually reach a top and then start coming down is that society begins learning about the bad consequences of drug use. So there's a kind of self-education that happens over the course of an epidemic. People recall that this is bad, and it's bad for individuals, and it's bad for the society. And one of the ways to understand the role of the criminal law is to try to encode in our social institutions that memory that drugs are a potential threat to the society. And that drug laws stand there as a way of reminding us, even after we've forgotten quite why we passed the law, that these things might be bad, and also help us stand up in the face of easy opportunities to use the drugs and strengthen our resolve not to. So I don't want to make too much of drug law enforcement as a prevention item, but I do want to get it on the same page as education, and I'm honored to join General McCaffrey in focusing the bulk of our priority and attention on preventing drug use among kids so that we could avoid a future cocaine or heroin epidemic that would inflict long-term losses on the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. The second respondent is Deborah Prothero-Stith, a professor and assistant dean at Harvard School of Public Health. Deborah was before that health commissioner of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Her work in recent years has made her prominent in dealing with adolescent violence, where she has designed a number of highly regarded school-based programs. Deborah and Mark and I taught together in a course in violence, and it was a great pleasure. Deborah, glad to have you here.
Good evening. I thank the Forum and Institute of Politics for this opportunity to respond to General McCaffrey. This is actually my first time hearing you present, and I, like Mark, not only appreciate your comments, but have very little disagreement with what you presented. I'd like to focus on a few things that I found particularly appealing. The first is that I really appreciate the balance that you put forth between prevention, treatment, and interdiction. And I say that because I have heard two of your predecessors, and while I felt there was some focus on prevention in the past, I hear in your words an even greater focus. And as a public health person, I really appreciate hearing that. I also think that the focus on youth is quite appropriate, given what we know about when drug use starts and when experimental behavior starts, and what we know about even those who become addicted and have serious problems with drugs relative to when they began to use drugs. I liked the focus on youth and the focus on prevention, and really liked your discussion of better options for young people in terms of after school, and even that out of favor notion of midnight basketball. I do think that relative to issues of drug use and violence and other adolescent public health issues, giving young people something very healthy and productive to do is quite important. Once my husband asked me, and we are raising adolescents, how did my parents keep me from getting pregnant when I was a teenager? And I kind of thought that was an interesting question, and we laughed about it after he asked, because he asked with some seriousness. We were trying to figure out our rules and what we would do with our children. And I finally looked up and I said to him, you know what? They kept me very busy, very, very busy, literally taking me from activity to activity to activity. And things that I thought I wanted to do, that they may have even, now that I am a parent, I understand that this is possible, that they may have even made me think that I wanted to do them, were in large part some of what kept me out of trouble. And what I find very interesting is that when we talk about urban poor children, families without resources, I begin to appreciate that the ability to give your children something healthy to do in that out-of-school time is related to your ability to pay for some things. Not everything costs extra money, but a lot of things do. And I think we fall short as a society on that. I was actually struck, General, by your discussion of drug addiction as a neurochemical problem, and reflected back on the time during my medical training when we were less sure of that, and I suspect that even now there are some who are less sure of that. But I remember in particular a young man who needed to have a valve replaced in his heart because he had been, over the years, injecting drugs and had had several infections that included an infection on one of the valves in his heart. And I remember distinctly the cardiac surgeon saying to him, if you can stay clean for a year, we will replace the valve. Otherwise, there's no point in us replacing the valve, because with an artificial valve and continued injection of drugs, you will obviously have even greater problems. And what struck me about that was that I felt that we didn't have the science to say to this young man, stay clean for a year or you will die. Which is in essence what we were saying as his caregivers. And by that, I mean, as we learned more about the natural endorphins that are made by the body, and that the brain has receptors for opiates, if you understand a little physiology and the body's feedback mechanism, it is possible that taking opiates over time destroys the body's ability to make opiates or endorphins. And it may be that there is some structural change that requires that old thing called methadone maintenance, which became methadone detox. And now it seems that it's drive-by methadone that people get. So this notion that it's a neurochemical problem that deserves some scientific study, I would agree with, and I would put that on the table. Now, let me just say, I spent some time at a drug treatment program, moonlighting, when I was a resident. And that was an experience that caused me to want to add a couple of things to your remarks. Not that you don't have enough on your plate, but I would want to hear more about the issue of treatment. What struck me when I was doing physicals for those who were about to enter what was then a 21-day detox on methadone was that not only was there a very long waiting list, up to 4 and 5 weeks for some of the persons, but that it was sort of the luck of the draw whether you wound up in a program that used methadone or didn't use methadone. And whether you were in a program that woke you up at 5:30 in the morning and caused you to have to rigidly adhere to a schedule, or whether you were in a program that was trying clonidine or not. It struck me that we never said to a person who had diabetes, you know, I only use 20 units of insulin in the morning and 40 at night, and that's it. We, as a clinician, assessed the individual's circumstance and prescribed, whether it was insulin or oral medications or exercise or diet. And I don't think we've made too much progress on this, quite honestly. Not only do I think, and that was 87, actually it was earlier than that I was in my residency, we still have people waiting months for drug treatment, and treatment is still a pseudo-criminal justice activity as opposed to a medical scientific activity. So if you show up at a program that uses methadone, you'll get methadone. If you show up at a program that doesn't use methadone, you won't get methadone. Or if you don't have an opiate addiction and you show up at a program that has a certain philosophy, you adhere to that philosophy. And my sense is that it's kind of like a crapshoot, that you just kind of go until you find something that might work, and that doesn't sound a lot like treatment to me. So perhaps we could expand the treatment agenda in that regard. And then I would discuss one other thing that I'd like to add to your agenda or to your plate. And I didn't hear it in your remarks. Phil mentioned it a bit in the introduction. And that is that our enforcement of drug laws is not equal across race and class. In other words, it seems that race determines whether you are arrested and whether the mandatory sentences kick in, and you know, the jail time. That's a big problem, and perhaps you can say more about it. I do think you may have mentioned it. I remember the article in the New York Times that suggested that only one person in a few states in this country who was white had been tried at the federal level for cocaine, and that compared to numbers in the 20s and 30s in those same states of blacks who had been tried. And given your numbers of users and what we know about how that looks, I'd like to hear a little more about that. The issue of marijuana for medical purposes, it's hard to disagree with your comment. I do think that we need to do the kinds of medical studies that allow us to say that this is safe and effective. And I think we need to get to the business of doing that very, very quickly. It fits in with a lot of other medical and scientific investigation that I think needs to take place around the issue of drug use. So thank you for broadening the agenda around prevention, and perhaps you have some comments on this issue of treatment, and specifically around the issue of race, because I think this, for this country, is a critical issue.
I think I'll ask General McCaffrey if he'll try and work answers to Deborah's questions into his answers so that we can go to the floor a little bit. I think after that slashing, burning attack where Mark Moore said that General McCaffrey's program was wonderful, and Dr. Prothero-Stith said it's even better than that, I hope we'll get some probing, difficult questions from the floor. Please give your name, please identify yourself and ask the question. I'll stand up here, but you know, they'll go to General McCaffrey. Why don't you begin behind the...
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Coleman, and I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School in the Masters in Public Administration program. And I just have a brief question for you. In regard to your remarks indicating that the plan is to significantly increase monies for treatment and prevention, we talk a lot here at the Kennedy School about how to get issues on the agenda, and once they're on the agenda, how do you get them through legislation? In the face of the type of the political makeup of the current Senate and House, my question is, I guess basically, what do you think the prospects are of getting that kind of legislation through, in the sense that we're still dealing with a very pervasive attitude that this is a will problem, a weak will problem, and not a psycho or a neurochemical problem? So essentially, do you think this idea's time, or are we really going to fight a huge battle to get this funding through?
Well, I think your question's an important one, because there are clearly problems. We lack credibility on the utility of drug treatment, period. And oh, by the way, it is absolutely the case that if you have a system of government that we're moving to, and I make no stance on it, which you have less federal money and more local money, and the federal money you do have, you batch up in block grants and you send it down to the lowest levels of government with the least constraints on it, and where you don't demand feedback loops through bureaucrats in Washington, you end up with waste, fraud, and abuse. And if the GAO catches you on that, if they go out and check in a state and find safe and drug-free schools money being misused for teacher education and for dental hygiene, they cut your safe and drug-free school monies by 60% on a given year. Now, I used to teach American government. There's an axiom of American government: drugs budgets in general don't go up or down by more than 8%. You get a bad program, it takes 10 years to kill it, but not in this issue. So we think we have a challenge, and there are a lot of decent men and women in public life, in city councils, state legislatures, and the Congress, who remain to be convinced that prevention and treatment are fundamental to getting at drug abuse in America. Now, I would also tell you the good news is last year we put a $15.6 billion program through Congress with bipartisan support. And oh, by the way, some of the most knowledgeable people in America on the drug issue are in Congress. Orrin Hatch, Joe Biden, a wonderful young man, Rob Portman in the House, Steny Hastert, Steny Hoyer. There's a lot of people that know what they're talking about. Some of them, it's almost their life work, 15, 20 years. And I think they'll be very supportive of what we're trying to do. I also believe that in our system, eventually a good argument, a convincing case made in terms that are appropriate to the target audience, win out. One of our problems is we haven't talked about the utility of drug treatment in taxpayer terms. So you may hear me arguing that I'm not going to support drug treatment programs because I'm compassionate, because I have some Christian sense of concern, because there are children, because I think it's the right thing to do. I'm going to support them because it's cheaper than the alternative. We're spending $17 billion a year on prisons. The construction rate of U.S. prisons is higher than the construction of military facilities in our country now. So we're going to have to make the right arguments. I also tell you, we've got to be devastatingly honest in our own self-evaluation. I got to go down to Congress. This strategy says we got 5 goals. We wrote supporting objectives for each one. We're writing measures of effectiveness for the objectives. I've got to be able to go down there and say not how much money I threw at the process, but what did we achieve as an output function. If we can't do that, we're going to dissolve the political support for what we're doing. So be an optimist. We just sent down a program that's $800 million higher than last year's 9.3% increase. That got through OMB, that got through the departments of government in a greatly reduced U.S. budget. So far, so good. But we need broad-based participation in the political process. Who's going to speak up when this bill goes to the Hill. And I welcome your involvement in that. Thanks very much for that question.
I'd like to ask people to ask questions that don't require such long answers.
Try. My name is Dean Leckie, and I'm a student at Harvard Law School. And I'd like to preface my question with, I've never touched alcohol, I've never smoked marijuana, I've never done any illicit drugs. And I guess my question is, first, I want to say that I don't know whether marijuana has any medical benefits. And the reason I don't know is because there's been no scientific tests done on the medical benefits. I mean, they've done tests that say there's carcinogens, they've done tests that say what the harm is, but there haven't been tests done on the medical benefits. And I'm glad you brought up Orrin Hatch, because I believe he said that if marijuana was medically beneficial, the FDA would have approved it. However, nobody can know whether marijuana is beneficial until FDA testing occurs. Recently, the FDA approved the protocol, and in fact, it helped formulate the protocol for a study to test possible medical benefits to marijuana. The problem is the only legal source in the country for marijuana is from NIDA, which falls under the National Institute of Health, whom you also mentioned. And NIDA refuses to give the 2.5 kilograms necessary for the test. So my question is, how will we ever know if marijuana has medical benefits until the government allows scientific FDA-approved testing to proceed and stops holding up the marijuana necessary for the test? And how can the administration say that if marijuana were medically beneficial, the FDA would have approved it when the FDA-approved tests are thwarted?
I think your question's a legitimate one. I think in some ways it's probably less than completely useful for a law student to debate a policy guy about a medical issue.
Well, I don't claim to have any knowledge.
Now wait, you get to ask the question, but I get to choose the answer. That's the deal. What I've put on the table is the notion that I accept your premise. I think there ought to be a reopening of the investigation of the possible medical benefits of smoked pot. It is not completely the case, to be honest, that we don't know anything about it. Now, I'd be glad to provide you with the information. The National Institute of Health asserts his current understanding of the drawbacks and potential benefits of smoked pot. For example, they believe, along with the American Ophthalmological Society, that smoked pot ain't a good therapeutic agent for glaucoma. It still needs to be looked at. I don't think you should ever shut the door on an allegation, because one of the things you might do is unravel 435 compounds in smoked marijuana. We did it in the 1980s. We pulled out THC. We made it available. Maybe there's 7 more compounds that need to be made available. So basically, I guess I would buy your idea that it ought to be looked at. You've just heard it's going to be looked at. It's going to be looked at by the Institute of Medicine and by the National Institute of Health. And I'd also suggest you, though, to be fair, if I believe the NIH, Dr. Alan Leshner, there has been one proposal to study smoked pot in the last 10 years that went to the NIH, and it flunked peer group review. So there's a bit, now, there's also a fear factor in there. Maybe there's a lot of researchers that said, you know, we'd never get it approved, so we won't send it in. So what we've said, we meaning Harold Varmus, Donna Shalala, and I, the door is wide open. It ought to get looked at. It will. And I think this medical scientific process is so precious to the American medical community. We ought to do it that way and not based on what you or I think the scheduling of LSD ought to be. Thanks very much for that comment, though. I think it's an appropriate one.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name's Charles Goodman. I'm a senior at the college. General McCaffrey, you talked about the great harm that alcohol does to society, just as illegal drugs do. Now, we tried prohibiting alcohol, and that turned out to be a terrible mistake. What's the difference? What makes alcohol prohibition a bad idea and marijuana prohibition a good idea?
We know, I normally really hate that question. And let me tell you why I hate it. Most of us who know the history of it believe that prohibition of alcohol was a period in America where the gigantic damage done to U.S. society by this mildly addictive substance went down and was the lowest in the history of our country. From the day we put prohibition into effect, it reduced almost every imaginable consequence of alcohol abuse in America. And the day we ended prohibition, in fact, it started back up. So what I would do is sort of appeal to your intuitive instinct. If alcohol, and we're not sure of some of these stats, is about 10% addictive over time. We all drink a lot of booze. About 10% of us end up addicted. Causes a big problem. 10 to 18 million alcoholics, $150 billion damage, 100,000 dead. Terrible consequences. 3.6 million people addicted to illegal drugs. They're unavailable, socially disapproved, against the law. We're going to enforce the law. We're trying to kill an illegal market. What would happen if we legalized methamphetamines? Would the problem get better? Not in our own experience. We think there'd be more people addicted. Now, most of us wouldn't touch them. Basically, if you're 25 years old and you're working your fingers to the bone, starting a business, having children, cocaine's widely available, we're not going to touch it. Right now, 5% of the country uses illegal drugs. What would it be if we legalized meth, crack, heroin? We think it'd be higher, not lower. We think the problem would be more intense. That's the experience in Great Britain, the experience in other societies that tried it. So if you ask me for my personal viewpoint about should alcohol be prohibited, no. It's not against the law. It's a cultural norm in this society. Most Americans don't have a problem with alcohol abuse. And by the way, I wouldn't ask to address it, except for alcohol abuse by adolescents. If you're asking me if I think we ought to legalize these other drugs, I don't believe we should. But it's certainly a legitimate debate topic for an American free society to entertain. 86% of the American people don't think we ought to legalize these drugs, and I am one of them. Thank you. On marijuana, I also don't believe we ought to legalize marijuana. I'm against making marijuana more widely available. 8 million Americans use it regularly now. We think it's extremely harmful in its consequences on adolescents for gateway behavior to other addictions. We think it's a cancer-causing psychoactive substance that causes people to crash cars, teenage pregnancy, ineffectiveness in the workforce. We're against it. I don't think the problem ought to be solved primarily through law enforcement. And I think it ought to be primarily solved by social disapproval of pot use combined with active alternatives for kids. If you never smoked any pot and you hit 21, you're not going to start smoking pot. So anyway, that's my own view, and that's the view of a lot of Americans, but certainly other viewpoints are legitimate.
Yes, sir.
My name is David Calvert. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and I'd like to thank all the panelists for your remarks. First, I was a little surprised that no one really took on the interdiction efforts in the Southern Hemisphere. My sense is that, for example, the NPR report that was on Monday this week, which talked about, AID buying, paying farmers to burn their crops of cacao, and then later people planting them again and then getting paid again, and the person running that program saying it's going to take 5 years to try to reach some equilibrium in this thing, and there's no guarantee long term, and it just seemed like sort of a sieve that the American taxpayer is paying for, and it's not really sort of taking us anywhere, and really that the effort needs to be made back in the States on the prevention and treatment side, and sort of leave some of those interdiction efforts sort of to lessen at least, if not end. And I guess I'm really coming from the other side. I'm from East Harlem, and it's a neighborhood that's been really devastated. Anybody that knows the neighborhood knows that in the 80s when crack came in, really the neighborhood went into almost rigor mortis, and people lined up in the streets, literally lined up 24 hours, 20 and 30 and 40 at a time to buy crack. So it hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years either, although the crack lines are a little shorter. I think that what we really need to do is get out of the war on drugs terminology, and this is maybe, General McCaffrey, maybe a challenge to you, and to really make a mobilization for youth. In other words, get out of the anti-terminology and get into the pro-terminology, and say, we're going to make it so that you kids in the inner cities don't have to wait online to get into the swimming pool in the summertime, like I had to do as a kid, because there were too many people in the pool, and so you had to wait in the hot sun, you know, an hour, 2 hours till people left so you could get in. And you kids don't have to sort of not have libraries that are open, you know, during the hours that you want to go to the library. Right now the libraries in New York City are open about 4, 6, 7 hours a day. Used to be, they were always open, but they're not anymore. And then the schools that don't have after-school centers anymore like they used to be sort of structured in things. And a parkie, a guy that was in the park and taking care of it. I mean, I think that if this nation could make a mobilization for youth opportunity, put it that way, for youth opportunity, then I think the kids could feel like they're not just telling me what not to do, they're showing me a path to something more positive.
General McCaffrey?
Well, I welcome your remarks, and I invite you to apply for employment with ONDCP. It just nicely outlined a good bit of what I said earlier. I think you're on target. The only thing I would ask you to consider in context is source country reduction programs. We got a federal drug budget. It's in 14 different bills. 3.6% of it goes to source country operations. It is peanuts, and it hasn't worked. Now, it does some things good, though. The Colombians are fighting for their lives. Drugs are not just a problem to the United States, they're a problem to our democratic partners. Drug abuse in Rio is worse than in Boston. Drug abuse in Caracas is worse than in Detroit. Drug abuse in Pakistan is far worse, immeasurably worse, than drug abuse in Baltimore. We have 2% of the world's heroin addicts. Now look, we got a president of Bolivia who is a man of incredible integrity and initiative and energy, and one of the reasons he's still in office instead of a drug criminal is because we're supporting his government in the drug effort. I would also suggest to you that drugs are more devastating by far to Mexico and Colombia and Peru than they are to us, and it's our money causing that, fueling that crime wave. So it seems to many of us that some of these programs definitely are beneficial. Alternative economic development in Peru is worth doing. Cooperative efforts with Mexico. Our future lies with Mexico. We must do it. And it worked in some of these situations. Thailand, in 20 years, has gone down to 1% of the opium production in the region. They brought drug addiction down to 400,000 some odd people. We owe it to the international community to be responsible partners in confronting the drug issue. And that's what we're doing in a very modest way. But I take your point, we need to be more effective about what we're doing.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amy Heller. I have a background in public health and I'm pursuing a PhD in healthcare policy. My question's about needle exchange programs. They're a proven public health measure to decrease the spread of disease in intravenous drug users. While needle exchange programs are a positive public health measure, they've been viewed extremely negatively politically. And I'd like you to comment where does the legitimizing of needle exchange programs fall within the boundaries of our national drug control policy?
The issue is one that I have deferred for the first year, getting actively involved in it. At one time, I had a reporter in there, and I explained to her why I didn't want to address the issue, and that was the main story that she put out. Let me tell you about one of the beautiful events in this job. I went to the free clinic in Haight-Ashbury, Dr. David Smith, people struggling against the consequences of addiction in a practical way. There's this beautiful woman there. She's, I don't know, maybe she's an old person like me, 54 years old, full of energy, and she says, look, what I do, here's what I do. I try and confront drug addiction among women. in this region of the city. And so I got this storefront operation, and it's got 12 beds in it. And oh, by the way, I now got an annex, and it's got 6 beds in it for HIV-positive addicted women. And I go out in the street, and I find women who are addicted, and of course a lot of them are involved in criminal enterprise, prostitution, whatever. And I say, why don't you come home with me and spend the night? And a person say, wait, now is this a drug treatment program? Oh, no, no, no. All we want to do is offer a hot shower, a hot meal, and friendship. And then the next morning, we say, would you consider spending another day with us? And through that process, they've worked enormous numbers of people through a series of little miracles out of drug addiction and back into real life. Those programs cost money. Needle exchange programs possibly can affect some subsectors of the addicted population. But I don't want our society copping out and using palliative measures on those who are addicted. I don't want my son, my daughter, left under a bridge at age 31, addicted to heroin, and comfort myself that I'm doing needle exchanges. I want to aggressively get out there, run an outreach program, get methadone maintenance active for the third of the heroin addicts that may respond to it. I want to get serious about drug addiction, and I'll tell you, it's cheaper, Mr. Taxpayer, if you do that than if you don't. Oh, by the way, we currently have a federal law that says don't use federal dollars on needle exchange programs unless you can demonstrate 2 things. It reduces AIDS and it doesn't increase drug abuse. Pretty high standard of evidence. Jury's out. Local programs appear to work, but it's peripheral. Let's get serious. We've got 50% of the treatment capacity we need in this country for the addicted. That's where the attention's got to be. Thanks for that question, though, because I think it's a flashpoint question.
Firstly, General McCaffrey, I'd like to ask you what you offer by way of explanation to the American people when it's reported that the CIA, over objections of the DEA, has allowed or authorized a shipment of over $1 million worth of cocaine from Venezuela into the United States. And secondly, a young American woman who was a student at MIT is in prison, sentenced to life in prison in Peru by a secret military tribunal. Her name is Lori Berenson. I believe you're aware of the situation. Our government has called for a fair civilian trial for her. Yet after she began to, she was imprisoned, you visited Peru and you visited with Fujimori, and a character by the name of Vladimir Montesinos, who's been linked to death squad activity, apparently showed up at this meeting. And it appeared, or at least there was an appearance of yours giving a kind of seal of approval to some of these people in Peru, who he incidentally has also been thought to be linked to narco-traffickers himself. So I wonder, is human rights taking a back, in what it seems that human rights was taking a back seat, and it seems, I just wonder how appropriate it is for you to be appearing to give approval to these people while at the same time we're saying to the government of Peru, hey, we've got an American citizen in prison and this person deserves a fair civilian trial.
Well, look, the human rights situation in the world, in our hemisphere, in the Andean Ridge, is a central, unequivocal aspect of our U.S. foreign policy. It has been, thank God, for about 10 years. I personally think it is, people ask me, what's the U.S. strategy toward Peru, the U.S. strategy toward Burma? We almost never have a strategy. We can't seem to bring ourselves to put together a strategic concept. We do have principles, and one of them is human rights. The rule of law, respect for the dignity of people. It's what makes our country worth living in, and it's something we're very proud to say is the dominant theme in our U.S. foreign policy. It's caused us enormous difficulties on a subset issue, but we're also rule of law, free market economics, and drugs. Drugs killing 16,000 Americans a year and doing devastating damage, by the way, to the hill tribes people in Burma and to the poor suffering population of Peru, 200,000 people trying to survive growing coca at $400 a year, while our people out here outside of Harvard University are paying $250 a day to stay in their cocaine habit. Oh, it's a problem. We're trying to balance these issues. I would also suggest to you that the government of Peru, in my own view, has made major changes for the better in the human rights situation. They've gone from 5 years ago a country that was unraveling with internal insurgencies, enormous levels of violence, to one in which the internal war is largely over, about 80% of it. They're trying to return the rule of law, civilian police, back the military out. Systemic repression is, according to the International Red Cross and other observers, going way down. They are a constitutional democracy. They have an elected legislative branch and a chief of state who is elected with a higher percentage of the vote than any other head of government in the hemisphere. So, we are committed to working with these people. And oh, by the way, American notions of democracy and other cultural norms are not necessarily something we're going to dictate to other democratic cultural systems. Now, Montesinos ain't my appointment. By the way, it is my own view that he is not involved in the drug trade. I think Fujimori and his senior people view this coca production threat as a destructive to Peruvian economy, destructive to their children. They're not going to declare war on 200,000 campesinos. They're not going to eradicate coca until we got alternative economic development in place. We spent peanuts there, 25 million bucks. Let's get serious about it. 80% of the cocaine in America comes out of the Huallaga Valley and the Upper Morabac Valley to the south. The bottom line is, I think the Peruvians are on the right track, and I think we ought to work with them and continue to applaud their successes and privately, sir, encourage their continued movement on areas in which they need further work. But that's my own view, and I thank you for asking that question, though.
Did you want to address the first question?
I think we ought to move on, not to protect General McCaffrey. I'd rather he had to answer hostile questions.
The CIA thing, let me just, because first I've heard that approach to it. Normally what I hear is crack cocaine, 1985, Los Angeles.
This was reported in the New York Times.
Yeah. My own view, I've worked with the CIA at close range for the last 5 years. I think there's some brilliant women and men in the CIA. I think they're a vital aspect of American national security. I think they're a tremendous asset in the drug war. I think they're an institution in tremendous pain as they shift from confronting the Soviet bloc to constructing a global era of stability. I don't believe there's any truth that the CIA has been or is now involved in illegal drug shipments to the United States. The 1985 issue, though, has so concerned the African American community that I flew out to Chicago. I appeared with Reverend Jackson. I have gone back and made it an issue with the Congressional Black Caucus that it must be investigated. It's a charge of such serious consequence that it must be looked at. The CIA IG is going to look at it. There's a Congressional Oversight Committee that will examine that. We have a separate Department of Justice investigation into that, and there's a separate investigation in the DEA. And at the end of the period, we've got to have the news media and other disinterested observers who are persuaded that the truth has come out, and if there was wrongdoing, it's published. punished. And so, so I think that's what we got to be committed to. It's a legitimate concern.
I'm afraid this has to be the last question, and I apologize to those of you who have been waiting. Just going left and right, it's your turn, sir.
Thank you. My name's Dick Evans. I'm a lawyer. I'm another short white guy. My question, General, has to do with the 1997 National Drug Strategy, and especially your first priority, which is enabling America's youth to reject illegal drugs and substance abuse. My question is, based on the calculations that have been worked out in your office, can you tell this audience with some precision how many more adults are going to have to be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned in order to achieve that particular goal? And this is not an essay question, General, though. I'm just looking for a number.
I don't know. And why would I know the answer to that? The what I started off, there's a bit of polemics to the way you obviously posed the question. What I would share with you is a concern that you can't arrest your way out of the drug problem. I don't think dealing with the adolescent drug use problem has been primarily a function of the criminal justice system. I think it's been a failure of the drug prevention, education, engagement of youth, the change in the American family. There's a lot of reasons why kids are using drugs, and we essentially haven't tried to lock them up. What we have done is we've ignored the problem until we have addictive behavior. If you're using meth, cocaine, heroin, you're involved in the criminal justice system. 2.7 million people consume 80% of the drugs in America. 2/3 of them are involved in the criminal justice system in a given year. You are going to jail if you're addicted to one of these substances. Now, that's okay. What bothers me is not that you're going to get arrested, that society disapproves of your behavior. And by the way, the behavior isn't sitting there consuming drugs. It's beating your wife half to death. It's child abuse. It's property larceny. It's assault and battery. It's a series of behaviors, and you end up in a slammer. The problem is, are we going to have effective drug treatment programs that 30 days later or 7 years later puts the person back out into society with a follow-on care program that costs less than imprisonment and dampens down these terribly destructive consequences of addiction? That's what we lack. So railing against the imprisonment rate, and by the way, its incredible destructive impact on the black community. 11% of America is African American. 33% of the drug arrests are African American. 48% of the prisoners are African American. There are different manifestations to drug abuse in America. Why do we need a debate, this is a democracy, why do we have a 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powdered cocaine? It fails the common sense test. I don't think it was a racist impulse. I think it was a fear of the violence that comes along with methamphetamines, mostly lower socioeconomic white guys, and crack use, mostly lower socioeconomic black guys, even though more white people than black people use cocaine by far, to include teenagers. We got a social policy that isn't working out. We have to address it. I think the Sentencing Commission will come in this year. They will retable it. The election's over. We can have a more rational exchange of views on it. This Attorney General and this Drug Control Policy Director will push for less people in prison, more drug treatment, more flexibility, drug courts, break the cycle, treatment alternatives, and we will have as a goal trying to stop what to many of us looks like a failed social legal approach. That's what we can promise you. We'll see how the debate turns out. Take part in it. We'd welcome your viewpoint. Thanks for that final question.
And thank you, General McCaffrey. You're outspoken. You are frank. You got a wide-ranging set of views, and we appreciate you sharing them with us.